Hello and welcome to Questions and Concerns, a somewhat weekly podcast where I, Wallace, and my good friend Binkus ask a question that may not have an answer and bring up a concern that may pertain to only one of us. I am the wonderful Wallace, and I am joined by the beautiful Binkus. And this week, your question to me was, what is evil?
Yes, I asked you, what is evil? What makes something, or actually, no, it's quite generic. What makes something evil? What you could interpret it as. What is an evil action? And I wanted to also hear your take on, something that goes to the core of, I think, morality, like what it means to live. I really was also interested in your take on how to interpret it as well. So yeah, what is evil?
So I started at the idea of, if I'm looking at what is evil, what is good, right? So if I can define the inverse, then I can define the thing itself. So what I did was I said, what is goodness? And for the most part, goodness is a quality that is determined by people who believe themselves to be good and have power, if that makes sense. So a prerequisite of goodness is that it has not moral utility, but it has a definition that can be put in place by people who are quote unquote good and are therefore role models in this state. But that slides very easily into moral relativism, but I'll come back to that idea in a sec. I want to there's a little thought experiment that I found, and I will endeavor to link in the YouTube description box. And basically it goes like this. It goes, a robber has intended to break into an old woman's home for the past few months. He's been watching her, and he notices that she goes out every Sunday at 8 a.m. to church. And so he decides that that's when he is going to make his move, is 8 a.m. on the Sunday, right? He goes up to the house, he smashes the window, and then he notices the old woman lying on the floor. And he runs. He doesn't want to commit murder. He doesn't want to be down for a criminal action. And it just so happens that the woman was on the floor unconscious, not because she had died, but because there had been a carbon monoxide leak, and his breaking the window ended up saving her life. Now, the first question is, do you think that the burglar should be punished?
I do, definitely.
Yeah?
I think the right thing to do at that point would be to check on the old lady. If you really honestly call yourself someone who does not go out and murder people, and all you're doing is just trying to survive or just trying to make some money on the side by robbing into people's houses, if that's the line of what you're the pressures you're under.
So that's your line.
If that's your line and that's what you're saying is you're trying to be morally consistent with that, then you wouldn't leave an old lady on the floor who may actually be in a diabetic coma, far more likely than a carbon monoxide poisoning. You'll probably let that person who might have been fine if you had called an ambulance end up brain damaged, dead. Those are the two options. And
Okay.
because of your negligence, you could have just said, oh, I was walking past and noticed the old lady was on the floor. You could have said some bullshit. You could have said nothing and just used a public phone. You could have done any of those things. If you just ran away, then yeah, you're the same thing as seeing that old lady on the side of the road and just walking past. That's the same level.
It's like a spectator sport. at that point where you're just watching human misery.
And that, for me, that is far more disgusting than just a common house thief. Like, that is actually a far lower act.
Okay, so you're saying that the cowardice in this story rarely angers you. What about the fact that the woman's life was saved, though?
I think
That it wasn't a diabetic coma, and just by pure happenstance, do you think that that should have an effect on the sentencing, or no?
Well, it shouldn't, but unfortunately it will, because that's the way society works. Like, society often gets in the way of what the law wants to do. Like, the law can prosecute it, but whether or not it's a lenient or... Because judges, especially in the US, judges are elected. So how they react to landmark cases also sets the standard of, you know, their political bent. If they're more of in a...
Their political tenor.
Yeah, if they're trying to be more of a hard-on-crime kind of candidate, they can't let something like that slide.
Okay.
They'll be overly harsh. So in the same way that, you know, even if you say that the judiciary is actually quite, you know, separate from mob rule, and it's not just, you know, which I believe that. I believe judges, by and large, are not corrupt. But I just also believe that their power can go to their head.
Here's a little question for you. What do you think jury of your peers means, and do you think that it's still applicable today?
I don't think anyone alive today has lived through an era like a jury of your peers, like society. Like, that society died a long time ago.
Why do you say that? When I say jury of your peers, what does that mean to you?
Well, that means to me is a legal system where a person is brought before the court, and the court, the members of the court decide on the guilt or the innocence rather than a single person. And as far as I can tell, that died around the 15th century in the UK. Ever since then, we've had judges hold real power.
What I would say is this, is that a jury of your peers is, to me, the definition is more people who were part of your community, so would know the substantive facts of the matter and would also know the parties involved, because I think that that's part of the issue, is that people are judged on a single instance, and there's so many ways to paint the truth in that moment that the legal system has become somewhat of a joke. You know what I mean? And I do think that there is a quality of punitiveness in the legal system at the moment. I do think that if we can punish, we do. And I don't know if that has been around forever, but I don't think that we have lived through a generation where we have a jury of our peers where, you know, we all live in a town and everyone knows everyone involved in the matter and is able to make kind of a substantive decision on all of the facts.
No, thinking about it a bit more, I think I was being a bit hyperbolic. Like, I do believe it's existed, and it probably even still exists today, but it exists in primarily rural communities for that reason. And that's the distinction. As I recently saw an exhibition that explained that I think as of 2018, or 2017, more than 50% of the world's population lived in cities. That was the actual definition of a common human society now. And that
is a city living,
is a city living individual. And that changes in the same way that Genghis Khan instinctually knew the difference between a rural peasant who could be self-sufficient with a few animals versus someone who lived on the other side of the wall in China, and how fragile they were. Like, there's a reason why he was so successful, and it's a reason that's probably been missed today, where the rural society of humans living in towns the size where they can actually know everyone's name. Essentially, that's the definition. When the society is that small, when the township is that small, and everyone knows each other's name, like things like the need to go into great detail in all your legislation for what is a crime, what is What is a crime of theft, and in how many different ways can theft still occur? Is it still theft if a company like charges too much on insurance? Is it still theft if a company changes their terms after it's been signed? Like, none of these things needed to be put into written rules, because people just understood if you cheat someone, you'll explain that on a case-by-case basis, and people understand that someone's gone out to cheat someone else and they'll be punished for it. That was enough. Like, don't be a cheat. Like, that was the law. You know, you didn't need to go into, and
There was mob punishment.
And the fact that, like, what I want to point out is that the fact that we need like 2 bookcases to hold all our laws now shows you that we don't live in a society that we should be living in anymore. Like, if society is that complex, complexity means there is no society. We're just an economic zone, which is a term I've started to see more and more of. We're living in an economic zone. We're all like merchants trying to sell our time for money, and, you know, keep to ourselves in our little lifeboats. You know, don't anger any of our neighbors. You can't really get to know them because the currents will just wash you in different directions tomorrow.
I thought you merchants stuck together.
We're all merchants. We're all on little rowboats floating in an ocean. Yeah, there's no point getting too close to anybody else because the winds may like split you apart. So no one bothers having any close connections anymore. We're in an epidemic of loneliness. And we're also an epidemic of atrophy. And this is what I think is underlying. It's underlying the cultural shift, is that when you have the majority of your population, and I'm including even now people who live in what's so-called rural, like if you're living in a rural town of 300,000 people, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not rural. That's still a city. Like, you got to understand, humans weren't evolved to live in societies this large. Like, it's not psychologically consistent with the way we.
Well, the level of input that we receive is not commensurate with our ability to interpret. But back to the courtroom, right?
Yes.
So, and the small town. Both of those areas have a common cultural foundation. And this is where this idea of cultural relativism can come in. Because moral relativism naturally kind of lends itself to this idea of cultural relativism, where, that's not bad, that's just a cultural practice, right? And so when we're talking about these cultures, or we're talking about moral relativism, what I want to say is this, is that if you look at cultural relativism that way, and you say that the culture can't be wrong because it exists within its own microcosm, then Nazi Germany couldn't have been wrong during its period of rule, because it was culturally in line with its fascist dictates. Now, do I think that that should be an argument that one can put forth? No, I think it's kind of insulting and ridiculous. But I think that moral relativism, on the face of it, at least recognizes that there's a universal set of principles upon which our morality is built, because moral relativism acknowledges that morality is born from a culture, and for a culture to form, there has to be some shared sense of something, anything.
Now, there's an example I've heard of where it challenges like the view of what is moral, and it's based on a historical peoples who, now I don't want to misattribute it, so I'm just going to say that from memory, it's a peoples who lived in small communities on islands somewhere in the world. I mean, that's enough detail to set the context. So these people had a practice where the older men would recruit young boys of the village and essentially get the boys to give them blowjobs, because they believed that by the young boys eating semen, they would develop maturity.
Yeah.
And this was like a cultural practice. And there was no shame about it. It was apparently not about Like, it wasn't about power dynamics. They weren't abusing these people, and the young
Well,
people when they were.
I don't want to go that far. I
Well,
don't
no,
wanna say
listen,
that.
because the researchers did. They interviewed the young people and they asked them, and the young people had no concept of them being taken advantage of. They just thought it was part of growing up, like
Yeah.
it was just a practice of their people.
So it's culturally accepted as a practice. Do you
Yes.
think that it's a practice that we should import?
No, I don't. But that's not the point. Is that
No,
moral?
is the point. What I'm saying
Well,
to
suppose
you
it is.
that when you look at morality and you look at goodness, yes, the people who are in charge or who are good, quote unquote, get to define what goodness is. And I do think that we've made progress. I don't think that, young boys eating the semen of older men, even if it's not a traumatic experience for them, and I don't think that it necessarily would be, because I do think our culture dictates how we respond to an experience. But I don't think that there aren't problems that present themselves there, that there has to be at least one person who's taking advantage of this system,
Now,
who's using it in a way that is not, in the way that was intended. And I know we can't base all of our laws around the outlier, but for example, homosexuality was forbidden, right? And it was looked at as a pathology in the West. I would say that it's progress that we have depathologized homosexuality. However, those in the church may not agree, given the state of where the church is now and attendance rates, etc., in the Western world where homosexuality is accepted, whereas in other countries where it is still punishable by death, the Catholicism is still very, very strong. So it is about what you think kind of fits you. So what I'm saying is that there is this idea of evil, but to come face to face with it, you also have to come face to face with the fact that you might think that certain cultures are better than others.
if you read popular media today, or you watch popular media, like I'm talking about news in the form of video or written, the impression you get is that most people don't think this way. But then when you speak to people in real life, and as soon as you get to know someone and get behind the veil of, everyone worrying about saying anything that could be potentially offensive to anybody else, because we constantly live in fear and don't want to start fights with other people because all of us are not part of a society that's like it's become the majority now. Like, we haven't done like a 10-hour work day in a field and could hold our own if someone punched us. Like, we'd be worried that we'd have one hit and die. Like, if that's what the majority of the population starts to internalize,
well,
people...
I think Tyler Durden said it best, right? Our great war is a spiritual war, and we have no Great Depression. Our Great Depression is our lives.
Yes, so these people, if this kind of person becomes the majority, you develop a society where, say, the average person puts on a mask and you don't actually know what they're thinking most of the time, because nobody wants to let their thoughts be known to anybody else. And so my question is, how many people actually see a disconnect between the real world and the world they're being fed to? And how many people just go along with it?
Well, I think box office receipts would reflect that most people are not very happy with the way that, media is trending. But then that leads to, hyperbole like...
You said box office before. So what I wanted to stop you there on is, you've mentioned that before. So you're saying that there's certain films that are like, how is the box office showing us that audiences are not buying this anymore?
Marvel is crumbling as a brand. I think that it's all over the place. I think it's diluted itself with television shows, all of this kind of stuff. Streamers are getting nervous because there's no exponential growth anymore. So they're offering tiers that include advertising and all of these kinds of things. I think that what you basically are seeing is a society that is content to entertain itself to death, and where the representation is often thought of as more important than the real thing. And that leads to people kind of signaling towards a product or a brand, even if they don't have allegiance to it in their heart. They just understand that they want to be a part of this group or the cool thing. They want to be Knauf.
And I've seen arguments that this kind of society is ripe for being taken over by authoritarianism. We're at risk of being taken over by fascists because of our apathetic nature towards politics.
Well, I think the idea that people have that they can't make a difference and that they are doomed either way really has kind of crept into popular consciousness. Like, you look at subreddits like anti-work and things like that. It's not just one person or one kind of source that's coming at this and saying that they lack meaning in their everyday lives. It's a lot of people, and when people are purposeless, that's when you get kind of paranoia and bad results.
No, interesting you bring up anti-work, because anti-work started off as a people's movement, but it didn't end that way.
No, it was submarine.
Like, how was it before that? How was it before that?
I think that you know anti-work far better than I do. I think you're more qualified to actually give an opinion on... I'm not a Reddit-hard.
What I remember from anti-work... Now, I had given up Reddit for a while because essentially I lost interest in it. I couldn't find anything interesting to follow anymore. They had sanitized it too much. They had turned it into Facebook. But anti-work, I came across being mentioned somewhere else. And I was compelled because it was something truly a distinguishing point in society where people were talking en masse about cultural revolution, about questioning capitalism on a grand scale without being ridiculed for it.
Well, you remember Occupy Wall Street, don't you?
I remember Occupy Wall Street, and what struck me was I remember going to work in the morning when the Occupy Wall Street largest protest started. I think it was in New York. Was it close to 1 million? It was record setting, and it was all over the news. Even where I was working, it was on the radio in the morning. And I remember I was working with a woman who would have been in her mid-40s, so you wouldn't say not the boomer stereotype, but their attitude was quite clearly, these lazy kids don't want to work anymore. Like, that's as far as they were willing to think about the issue.
I think that part of the problem, and I'm going to say part of the problem of the fall down of anti-work, but I'll let you explain that one, is that they were invited... So representatives from Occupy Wall Street were invited onto the Colbert Report to explain what exactly their goals were. And instead of sending the expert or the person who would speak to Middle America, they used a so-called progressive stack, and they sent some guy called Ketchup to explain to Middle America why banking regulation should change. And as you can imagine, it went down as a joke, and it ended the legitimacy of the movement. The anti-work story happened on a Fox TV interview, so they knew it was going to be hostile going in, so they chose someone who had media training. Anti-work organized an interview with Fox News to explain its remit and kind of its praxis, so how it was going to enact the lofty-minded philosophical ideas that these people had put together.
the media interviews one of Anti-Work's top moderators who had actually written a variety of posts, and from what I could see was one of the most, like, if there was, say, 10 posters who posted every day and made the front page, like, you could see common names coming up. This was one of those 10. It was someone who was very active in the community, was spreading its ideals, and they got selected to represent the anti-work community as a moderator, so claiming to be one of the leaders on a mass media finance channel. And what happened was this person showed up in like it didn't go to the studio, insisted on doing it in their home. So in the background you see like curtains from like a 40s bungalow old lady, like made of lace. So it's like this guy's living in some weird hovel. Yeah. He's wearing a hoodie.
It did give you the sense of like a retirement home, like that everything was covered in like doilies or, you know, plastic wrapped.
So, and I think that was intentional. I think they've rented that place because this was definitely a plan. So they've rented this place to make it look as drab as possible. This is
all speculation, by the way.
This is a story.
Yeah.
Yes. And so what they would have done, like in this story, is
gotten a man.
They would have taken this Reddit mod, and if either they were a plant all along, or they convinced them to go with this new story where this Reddit mod turns up to the interview wearing this dirty hoodie and talks about how he's a dog walker by trade. This is like not exaggerating.
Now you're being quite controversial with the pronouns.
And
you know that, right?
Oh, that's right. And they were also trans, but the kind of trans person who really, really wants to be a woman, but makes no effort in looking or acting like a woman. So very genuine one, definitely. So an insult to trans people, an insult to...
Pinkers can spot a legitimate trans from 100 meters. He can smell them out like a truffle pig.
Well, no, what I want to point out is that anyone who thinks that there is no difference, I invite them to speak to a trans person, because trans people don't put up with this kind of, like...
Yeah, no, 100%.
You're damaging their movement.
It's body dysmorphia. You want to look a particular way. You don't feel comfortable in your body. But anyway, without getting onto Binkus and his need to be a woman, let's continue on with how anti-work was submarined.
And yes, well, that was it. So like this fool says that they only want to work 20 hours per week, and they want to make a society where their dog walking for 20 hours a week could sustain them and give them a home and free education and free healthcare. Like, this was their argument. That's not a logical argument that anyone would have ever made. They exaggerated it to the point where it became ridicule, and therefore anyone who protested and aligned themselves with this movement, to anyone who hadn't heard of the movement yet, which was most people, instead of saying, oh wow, like there's a movement of social change, let's find out what it is, it became, oh wow, there's a movement of
idiots.
Of young idiots who are like wanting to not work anymore. Let's pull out the cane again because something's gone off the rails. Like, that became the attitude. Young people have gone too far and we need to like put them back in their place.
Young people have gone too far.
And what did we get? We got like things like the Patriot Act in this era. We got things like the Five Eyes collecting of internet data. When we used to demonize China for spying on their citizens, suddenly we do the same, and it's like, oh yeah, sorry, we forgot. Yeah, we do that now.
There was a poll on Twitter that was put out by the US Judiciary Committee yesterday asking whether Joe Biden and the FBI should be able to spy on American citizens. The poll results were 91% no to 9% yes. And I'm guessing the 9% were all federal agents who were like, I keep my job phone tapping people. I want to know what Marge is doing in her spare time.
I imagine it's very lucrative and well paid and secure.
Yeah, exactly.
With yearly bonuses and good healthcare plan.
Well, I mean, we got a lot during this era. We got the redefinition of torture to enhanced interrogation. We got Julian Assange locked in a prison cell for whistleblowing on the CIA and, you know, Edward Snowden now living in Russia for similar reasons, but with the NSA. I mean, we are moving further and further towards neo-feudalism. But to return just briefly to your point around good and evil, right? I think it behooves us to look at arguments from the side that we think is evil. And Noam Chomsky put it this way, right? Slave owners in the South argued that they treated their employees, i.e. slaves, better than those in the North because those in the North only rented their employees, whereas they owned their employees and therefore were far more likely to treat them well and to keep them alive for as long as possible. You know, like the difference between buying a car and renting a car, if we want to be crude. So I think there's some merit to the idea of what happens if we do bring back a safe form of slavery, or what happens if we do bring back a safe form of servitude where people who want safety can sign away the rest of their life to live and look after a family.
Do you take that argument on face value, though? The argument that the southern states made that they treat their slaves better because... Yes, no, I can... See, I think it's perverted the truth. I think the truth is that they provided more to their slaves. They might have provided them education. They might have provided them housing. So that materially...
Not too much education.
Like they would have given them... Yeah, they would have spent more on their slaves, but they definitely treated them far worse.
I'm not arguing for chattel slavery. Like, please, don't misconstrue.
Oh, no. I'm comparing it to the slavery practiced by the northern states. Like, there is a very big distinction. And that is part of what started the Civil War, because the northern states used their slaves. They didn't have vast croplands. They used them for more menial tasks like sweeping roads and...
Well, wage slave was a term that Abraham Lincoln literally used. So wage slave is something that has been beat. If you want to talk about ideas that have been beaten out of us through public consciousness or through media kind of formulation, the idea that being a wage slave is not a form of modern day slavery is very much something that has taken a long time to beat out of people and is bubbling beneath the surface very, very, very close to the top.
Something that... Now, this might interest you. Something that I believe Islam does very well is acknowledge in its teachings the risks of wage slavery by banning the charging of interest. It's along the same concept that a great disparity in wealth can be used to abuse someone, and that is no different to being... They codified it in the same way they would codify the other obscenities. You know, it was considered a crime.
Well, they made usury illegal. They don't have credit cards in Saudi Arabia. I do want to say, what I think is this. A truly evil act is when you are unwilling to exchange morality or conversations around shared morality with other people, because there is a common ground to be found with most people, if not all, that will satisfy both parties. That does not necessarily have to lead to aggression or to violence.
Not if they were nice.
So, yeah, not if they were nice as spice. So, if you just chill, everything will be all right. No. Honestly, I do think that the evil is when you shut down communication completely and you just vilify the other person as a monster or vilify the other group as monstrous without having any human or redeeming kind of moral quality. Because that's truly evil, because you have robbed them of their ability, of their right or the sanctity of their life.
So in a recent piece of long-form journalism, I followed the story of this family of 3 people who were indentured servants, or essentially modern-day slaves, in a village in rural India. All three of them, it was an elderly woman, a grandmother, the grandmother's son, who would have been in their 40s, and their young, or their teenage boy. I think the boy was about 12 or 13, quite young. But essentially, this young boy had known their whole life, living in this family that made bricks 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And making bricks in this rural village in India is something that's very much manual labor. The profession involves going out into a mine pit, which is generally quite in the middle of nowhere.
So you're saying it's something that you'd like to do, that it's like a lot of fun, right?
I'm saying it's something that people would see as cruel and inhumane torture if they've treated prisoners this way. Yet, see, that's the beauty of it. You can get someone to do something under the duress of poverty that even a prison couldn't force someone to do. Like, prisoners would refuse to do that. There would be a riot. Yet people actually sign up for it when the alternative is actually death.
What is the process of making a brick in this community?
So they go out into mines, which are generally in like quite rural areas, often in the desert. So imagine, this is the images they were showing on this story, that their mine was essentially in a desert. Wasn't really any way for them to grow their own food or take care of themselves, except for using the money they earned to pay for their living.
Like, can you imagine trying to escape through the desert? So the process involved them going out to the mines, getting the raw materials, bringing them back.
It was backbreaking labor. So this was all done manually. They had a wheelbarrow, and that was it. They shoveled the raw ingredients into a pit, mixed it with water, created the clay bricks, took this muddy clay, which is like, if you've ever actually used a shovel, you realize it's not as easy as it looks, and did that for 12 hours a day, shoveling this brick mud into a stencil of bricks, waiting for it to dry, and while they're waiting for that to dry, they make the next batch, and then the next day they go and they have to physically pull out each brick bent over out of the molds and put them into a pile for export. And this is what they did day after day, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And as they were doing this, they were getting paid a wage, but their wage was then docked, I believe, 6/7 or 5/7, some quite large ratio was going back to the company that was giving them this wage to pay off their debt. And what they were left with was barely enough for them to afford food, and that's it. So they were earning so little that they would never earn enough to be able to leave. Like,
they were literally wage slaves.
They were literally wage slaves.
Now let me ask you this. If Fisher-Price, you know how they have like easy bake ovens, or I'm not sure if that's Fisher-Price, but whatever, the home utensil kind of stuff, like the baby that shits itself, or like vacuum cleaners and stuff at home. Do you think if they made an at-home bricklaying set that it would gain in popularity?
I think it could be sold as a fun activity for children to get themselves out into the garden, build up some manual dexterity. It's good for, if you think your child's on the spectrum, because, like feeling the mud of the clay is like, I could sell this.
Yeah,
I could sell this.
It's very sensuous.
Yeah, sensory toys are like in every aisle of every Kmart now. It's a trend. Like, they know how to sell things. Every parent thinks their child is special and different, so they all want to buy them. And that's great. It means you don't have to pay like $30 for them. You can buy them for like $3 now.
So I'm thinking that this might be the perfect solution to the bricklayers problem.
What I'm saying is it's very marketable today.
Yeah.
And well, yes. And the point about the bricklayer story is that there are literal wage slaves. And I think that's a distinction between countries that allow wage slavery to exist and countries that don't, is something that is the actual distinction between the West and the rest of the world. And that is something that people don't acknowledge anymore, that there is a cultural difference, and that's where the line is drawn.
Yeah. Basically this idea of keeping people indentured to you is no longer acceptable unless they work for Uber.
Whatever disparity between you and another person grows to, they're still human beings and deserve a basic amount of respect. There's some things that just shouldn't be allowable, regardless of how much you can afford for them.
What do you think is an example of that? I can think of one. There was this guy who paid 6 handkerchiefs so that he could watch a 10-year-old girl get killed and cannibalized while he was on a tour of deepest, darkest Africa.
What did he pay?
6 handkerchiefs. So
this wasn't silk handkerchiefs for
journal.
like very valuable, I suppose.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if they were silk or not. I just know they were 6 handkerchiefs, and he, in his diary, wrote, "Oh, I thought they were in jest, but suddenly they brought this 10-year-old girl out and stabbed her in the chest."
So it's a place he discovered where either the human lives of their people or maybe their enemies, maybe they had like a huge population of captured slave people who they used as like for sport, essentially. And for them, selling you a slave for whatever amusement you wanted was no different to feeding him to the lions or whatever they used to do.
Or maybe they were showing such a great amount of honor to this person. They were like, this city. Like, he thinks that these are worth the life of one of our people, but, you know, we still want to trade with him because he seems to have, I don't know what.
Perhaps, think of it this way, though. Perhaps they didn't understand the test at all, and they actually wanted to trade. They wanted wealth. They wanted to be able to sell their like local wares to Europeans, and they were being fed this delusion that if you trade with the West, you'll become rich. Because how else would they like convince people to do it? Because you can't put a gun to someone's head and force them to trade with you. You'd go through it politically. You know, the old colonization techniques were not as brute force as people like to believe. Like, these people were not fools. That's the manipulation. So they would convince these people that becoming aligned with the great Western powers was a way to enrich yourself and gain what they have. You know, the beautiful streets, the cobblestone houses for your people, and everyone lives middle-class lifestyle. They thought it was a way to improve themselves economically. So that's what the benefit they thought was. They wanted to modernize. But the problem came when essentially the wealthy elites of the European powers tagged along for the ride, and they were following government efforts to, say, bring the people the Western values they desired, because they would rather have their neighbors be friendly towards them and have similar forms of government than be pirate states, essentially, because piracy was a huge issue back then. It was a solution to piracy. Like, where do pirates come from? Pirates come from a society where it's every man for himself, and if 20 people can live a good life, stealing everything and selling it and survive for their days, that kind of thing was rampant.
I will say this, that when you give people the option between life and death, and that means sacrificing even their dignity, most people will choose life, particularly if they have a family. So I can understand that Indian family, and I think that we run the danger of being slaves to either our own morality or the morality of others. And I think we can both agree that being a slave is not a preferable option. So, in this world of false prophets, do let us be your leaders, your shepherds amongst the flock. We will protect you against wolves, even in sheep's clothing. And we will see you in about a week or so. Thank you.